Welcome everybody. I'm Mark Fox, CEO of NetEvents. I'm delighted you can join us today for our session on SD-WAN and SASE Managed Services versus DIY. We have partnered with Dell'Oro Group, so Mauricio Sanchez, who is the Research Director of Dell'Oro Group and heads up their cybersecurity, SASE and SD-WAN services. Mauricio will be providing an intro to today's session to set the scene. That will be followed by a discussion with our panel that you see here. So I'll hand over to Mauricio for today's session. Mauricio, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, if the case may be. Welcome. I'm joined here today by a distinguished set of panelists to be able to have today's conversation. Quick rundown on who the panelists are, and then we'll have them in several minutes introduce themselves. As first, Craig Connors, VP and GM of the SASE business at VMware, and then we're joined by Parag Thakore, Senior Vice President at Netscope, and last but not least, Mark Cohn, leader of the MEF Security Test and Certification Incubation Group from MEF. So I'm really glad to have these distinguished set of panelists. Looking forward to some great conversation on the three topics we've bringing to you today. Before we jump in, I'd like to share with you a couple comments about this landscape of SASE and SD-WAN, and be able to level set, hopefully, today's conversation. Again, I'm from the Dell'Oro Group. We're a quantitative market research firm based in the Silicon Valley in California. I have been tracking SASE nearly 3 years, but we have been tracking the technologies that have been feeding into SASE much longer, including SD-WAN from its very inception, and access routing for the last 20 years, proxy technology since 2008 that now have become the latest trend of cloud delivered network security. So let's jump in. I always like to start off by level setting. Why are enterprises thinking about SASE? Why is this conversation about SD-WAN so relevant? I think we need to think about two anchor points. We need to think about the architectural anchor points of the traditional legacy network that has been with us for the past several decades, to be honest. And so it's an architecture that is predicated on a hub and spoke model. It was very hardware centric, or still is very hardware centric, with private MPLS circuits to connect and stitch everything together, and using VPN, IPsec, self-remote access, and very much a perimeter-based security philosophy, with the inside versus the outside being the soup du jour to how people look at the security. And as well, the operation model, which is on the right-hand side, the bullets. It was is for many still a world with centralized applications. So they don't live on the internet, they live inside the corporate perimeter, and very little in terms of what the outbound internet traffic represented, and the number of remote workers was an exception, not the rule. So again, something that it was a cloistered environment, and worked rather well for the environment that we lived in. But then, if we go back to 2020, what did we see from our research in terms of market forces that have altered the landscape and generated the interest in the technologies that are part of the SASE conversation? I think it's the increase in attacks and the cost of breaches that enterprises are facing. And I'll share a couple quantitative statistics in just a second, but the security threat level just raised substantially. Obviously, everyone had to stay at home due to the health mandates, and so it went from remote work to now we're entering this world of hybrid work, where it's a split time between in the office versus somewhere else in terms of the work and people doing their work responsibilities. And then lastly, the attention that got placed on the business's online experience. And by this, I mean, business had to go to be transacted electronically. It could have been paper in the past, very, very face-to-face, but now it had to be somehow more digital, more remote friendly. And so the role of the online experience all of a sudden became a massive point of contention. Being a quantitative firm, I always like to share a couple statistics, both from interesting work from the outside, but then stuff that we do. So as I mentioned, security techs increasing substantially. In 2022, IBM puts out a great report showing the cost of breaches. They continue to go up. They've gone up 13% in 2020. Now the average corporate data breach is over $4 million. That's a significant amount, and that's just the average. So some of them are extremely at a much higher level. According to a recent McKinsey report, 58% of U.S. workers are hybrid today, which is amazing, right? It's somewhere between a 3 to 10x jump before the, and this is the new normal that we see moving forward. Is this hybrid work is here to stay. And then lastly, the digitalization of enterprise, as measured by how much enterprises are spending on clouds, which we have a tracker in that space, significantly increased, almost a 2x jump here from 2019 to 2021, from 81 to 151 billion. So it's significant how much enterprises are investing. The legacy network that I just described fell flat for all intents and purposes during the, and there's 4 things I'd like to call out here in terms of the challenges that we heard about in our conversations with enterprises and the landscape in general. I'll start from the left and go to the right. So the left, the MPLS circuits were no longer enough, again, as cloud applications started to become the norm, not the exception. All of a sudden, the amount of traffic that needed to be piped between various points of the network became much greater and started to tax what are, in many cases, still expensive MPLS circuits, meaning that there had to be more money to spend, more money spent in order to upgrade to faster pipes, and that's not necessarily something any enterprise is looking to do. The security stack became a choke point there in the perimeter, and so again, this hardware-centric view just was not working as well as it did in the past. All of a sudden, remote workers, we heard a lot of instances of IT administrators pulling out their hair from VPN. All of a sudden, not enough capacity. It's like, what do we do? It's like, how do we support what used to be an exception to be now the norm? And so another point of contention, ultimately leading to things like poor app experience, which is the last bubble here, that all users were, why is my application all of a sudden run so slow? And it's very hard for me to do my job. What we've seen over the course of the last couple of years is a shift that set the stage for this conversation around SASE's Secure Access Service Edge, is that there have been some enabling technologies that have been brewing in the marketplace, which have set the stage. On one hand, you got networking like SD-WAN and the promise of being able to reduce the network operational costs. On the other side, you had a new breed of cloud delivered security solutions, which most recently have gone by the Security Services Edge, or SASE acronym, and we see these two being combined and have been combined over the last several years to drive a new topology. We won't get into the ins and outs, but to say the least, it's one that marries this cloud delivered network security services with a substantial amount of this SD-WAN capability that sits off on the edge, and they're coming together in service of this hybrid, very cloud-centric enterprise that now exists. Again, we here at Dell'Oro track markets, we track technologies, and so I thought I'd bring in a couple data points from one of my recent reports about just the size of these markets, the magnitude and the direction that these markets have recently taken. So what I'm sharing here is the value of the market, the total amount of the technology revenue that the technology vendors that fall into this SASE basket that we look at as, from a technology perspective, either being a networking SD-WAN or the security SSE. And I think should jump out at you right now that over the course of 3 years, there's been a sizable increase in the amount that enterprises have been spending, right? So I like to say enterprises are voting with their wallet. They're increasingly embracing this notion of embracing SD-WAN and SSE and a SASE class of framework. And so we're on track to nearly hit that $6 billion figure by the end of this year. So hopefully it gives you a little flavor from the Dell'Oro perspective about how we look at this landscape. At this point, I'd like to be able then to pivot today's conversation. But before we dig into each of these topics again that we've selected for you and be able to tackle today's topic, I'd like for each of the panelists to spend 30 seconds or so introducing themselves and the organization that they're from, and we'll go left to right. So Craig, please take it away and introduce yourselves.
Thanks, Maurizio. I'm Craig Connors. I'm the Vice President and General Manager for the SD-WAN and SASE business at VMware. I've been in the SD-WAN space for about 16, 17 years, much longer than we called it SD-WAN. And now excited to be here to talk with an old friend, Parag, who I worked with at VeloCloud, and a new friend from the MEF, Mark.
Thank you, Craig. That was a perfect segue. So Parag, on to you.
Thanks, Mauricio. This is Parag Thakur. I'm the Senior Vice President of Borderless SD-WAN at Netskope. Netskope is one of the market-leading SASE vendors with over 2,000 customers, including some of the Fortune 25 of the Fortune 100 customers.
Thanks for that, Parag. And last but not least, Mark.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Cohn. I'm from Spirent as a principal technology analyst, but today I'm representing the MEF. I actually lead the MEF SD-WAN certification program. I also lead the security test and incubation group, which is responsible for the transition and the evolution between where we are with SD-WAN and operationalizing SASE and Zero Trust, which are two new standards areas for the MEF.
Very good. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. All right, let's get into our first discussion. So the first topic, I always like to start with a wider aperture and then steer it to a particular focal point. And so for our first discussion, I'd like to start with you, Craig. And in the marketplace, there's a lot of definitions of SASE. I presented one predicated on the way that we look at it here at Dell'Oro. But again, starting with you, Craig, and then going on to the rest of the panelists, I'd like to first set the stage and have you answer the very simple question. What is SASE in 2022? And go from there. So, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Mauricio. So, I think you called it out in your intro that a lot of what we hear about today with regards to SASE is driven by the shift to the distributed workforce. A lot of people forget that the term was actually coined prior to the, and these things that were driving these shifts were happening already. Of course, remote workers is one, but IoT devices is a second one. Apps distributing and moving to the edge and to various clouds is another one. And then the rise in cyber attacks, and in part driven to the rise in cryptocurrency, which led to new and interesting ways to monetize attacks, also led to a surge in attacks. And so we were already rethinking, how we were going to connect and secure these new emerging use cases, poured a bunch of fuel on it, and it became, one of the most hyped terms in the industry. And so one of the challenges for the folks listening is whenever something gets very hyped, and we saw this with SD-WAN in the early days, one day there's 5 SD-WAN vendors, the next day there's 70. I think we're seeing the same thing in SASE because everyone wants a piece of that $6 billion pie that you shared. And so it's really hard to pin down exactly what SASE is because so many different vendors claim so many different things. So I think today, for me in 2022, we have to go back to the use cases and look at what you're trying to accomplish as a company. SASE is a framework for you to connect and secure your users anywhere they are to your apps everywhere that they are. And that's really what SASE has to be today until we have some sort of formal standardization, which I'm sure Mark will chime in on.
Thanks for that intro, Craig. What about you, Parag or Mark? You agree? You disagree?
No, I agree with Craig. I call it like SASE washing. So right now it's like a lot of SASE washing going on. And I still remember, right, like a few years back, I was presenting actually SD-WAN to a manufacturing customer. And it kind of goes back to what Craig said on use cases, right, where the manufacturing customer is like, man, you know what? I didn't understand a single word of what you said on SD-WAN. And I'm like, why? And it's like, for you to understand my problem, you need to come to my factory floor. So I fly out to their factory floor and they point to a machine. And inside the machine, there are sensors. And they're like, that's my new branch. And inside that branch, I have sensors and I don't have humans. And I need to connect that machine back to the cloud and get some analytics and remotely troubleshoot the machine. So the point being that, how do you deliver that consistent, uniform performance and security, not just to a branch office, but every user device, IoT endpoint, or multi-cloud environment? That is key. And when customers come out to us, fundamentally, we see two architectural challenges that they come up with. So firstly, we see people will say, man, I have this SD-WAN and I can say Zoom is high priority on SD-WAN. And then I go to a remote access client and I can't configure it. It's the same user moving home and it's the same user who is in a branch office. Can you tell me how can I do Zoom or Office 365 or my app is high priority no matter where the user is? And then you go to another set of vendors who are just focused on cellular connectivity. And then you go to fourth set of vendors who are just doing multi-cloud connectivity, right? So a lot of people are looking for that architectural convergence. They want to have that one software, one policy so that you can kind of cover not just your branch, but branch offices, remote users, cellular connectivity, and get your multi-cloud connectivity in a single framework. So that I call more of that architectural gap, right? That's the architectural challenge. But there's also a second challenge, which is more on the functionality, right? So kind of world has moved, right? Wherein you see people were, during SD-WAN days, you would talk about application aware. And now people are talking about being context aware, right? It's not just about apps, but it's app risk, user risk, device risk, right? So it's much deeper from a context perspective. And it's not just layer 7 awareness that kind of SD-WAN brought in, which is what SASE will bring in, right? By marrying the two technologies together. And then you have a lot of cellular needs. And then security is not integrated, but it's not bolt-on, it's fully integrated. And then there are edge compute requirements, right? So each kind of use case has its own ask in terms of what is required. But one thing I can tell you is the bar to be a pure play SASE vendor is very high, right? And we at Netskope believe we have a lot of technologies to make that happen. But again, be careful when you're picking that SASE solution, come up with a solid RFP with your requirements and be use case centric.
Thanks for that, Parag. I want to circle back to some of the comments that you, Craig, and Parag mentioned. But before I do, I want to give an opportunity to Mark, coming from the math and the work that you guys are doing. Now, how is it that you see SASE in 2022, Mark?
Well, first of all, I think it's an architecture. I mean, there is no question that the use cases that Craig and Parag were talking about are make it more instructive to talk about SASE. But this discussion, this roundtable actually puts a spotlight on the industry challenge of having a term like SASE or SD-WAN, or if we really go back in time and software-defined networking, we had the same challenge there 10 years ago. And until we have some way to get industry consensus, or at least industry reasonable agreement around what the terminology is, what the scope is, what the bounds are, then we have this discussion that individual service providers, vendors, system integrators, everyone in the ecosystem is going to have their own slant, and not to mention end users. They're going to have their own slant on SASE or on SSE, which we didn't talk about, but I'm sure we will in the next question or so. And what we are trying to do in the MEF is to recognize that it's an architecture, recognize that we're catering to our traditional service provider customer base that the MEF serves, and then be able to try to provide a language and a set of standards that can help operate a service provider actually weed through multiple vendors' solutions, not to actually create pure multi-vendor interoperability, which is not practical, but rather just to be able to help them manage this multi-vendor environment. And that's what I think the role of a SASE and Zero Trust standard, which is the other important companion standard to SASE that we're going to be addressing in the MEF, and how that's actually unfolding in the market.
Thanks for that, Mark. And I would also agree that SASE is in architecture, but within that, then going back to the use cases, because I want to focus here on the what is SASE, because we'll get to the next conversation here in a couple of moments to the how should SASE be implemented. So if we start from the standpoint that SASE is an architecture that can be applied to a number of use cases, going back to what you said, Craig, and as well as Parag, about the number of use cases that are coming into view, I think what I'm hearing is an expansion, and this is not the first time I hear it today. Whereas during the depths of in circa 2020, it was how do I make sure I can get my users to access their applications. Now it seems like there's derivative use cases that for which the similar style and architectural philosophy that SASE describes can be applied, because I heard you, Craig, mention about IoT, and Parag, you brought up the multi-cloud, right? Which was neither IoT nor multi-cloud was part of the conversation in 2020. So the question is to both of you, and as well as to you, Mark, is SASE something that will continue to, because it's an architectural approach, continue to evolve and continue to consume use cases, or is it something that enterprises can be laser focused and say, well, this is the biggest bang for the buck that I can get by focusing on these use cases? So I guess to me, that's kind of part of the challenge with SASE, right? Is that it can mean any number of things to individual enterprises. So perhaps thoughts on how to think of it as an enterprise and where to start thinking about it would be very interesting. So Craig or Parag, and we'll circle back with me. What do you guys think? Is SASE evolving and will continue to evolve, or do you feel that eventually it'll settle on a particular sphere of use cases over the next several years?
Yeah.
And Craig or Parag, either of you.
Yeah, I think the use cases are already there, right, Mauricio? We see customers' journeys can land in any of the use cases already. Like that's already happening. Customers can start their journey. Maybe customers have decided what the SD-WAN branch is, and they start their journey from multi-cloud. Or maybe they want to start with SD-WAN remote access or some sort of remote users, right? Or a branch of one. So I think where you land is important, and it's equally important to have that converged architecture where that wherever I start, I have this opportunity to move into various directions, right? So I can start with multi-cloud, but tomorrow I can move into SD-WAN, or I can start with SD-WAN, I can move to remote access. And I think that's possible if you have a consistent architecture, consistent framework that can give you that uniform security and performance.
I see. And within the space of use case, maybe my question should have been, is there a particular set of use cases where you think there's the biggest bang for the buck? Or is it really a question that every enterprise needs to take a step back and say, okay, what are my requirements? And from that, it falls out which set of use cases SASE will be the starting point for their journey. I think
get started with the remote users, but like as we discussed, right, it's not the only use case. There are all these use cases. And I do think that it can start with any of these different use cases that I was mentioning, and it can go in either direction. The key is for you to show the customers a path in terms of how you can migrate from one use case to another versus what the landing point is. So pretty much you can land anywhere and kind of expand from there.
I see. What about you, Craig or Mark? Any additional thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the power of SASE is bringing together remote access and SD-WAN and firewall and SWG and all of these use cases. And that means that you're not just displacing a vendor or displacing a solution when you come in. You're trying to really displace 3 or 4 vendors probably to simplify the overall approach for the customer. And so, to Parag's point, while that can be a challenge, it can also be a benefit because it gives you lots of different areas where you can begin based on the specific needs of the customer. Maybe they have a gap in their security story today, or they have a solution that's not working well for them. They start there and then they expand horizontally. And I think, one of the important things about, people say SD-WAN's the foundation of SASE and things like that. I think the thinking behind SD-WAN, the thinking behind bringing visibility to the end client, simplicity at scale, those kind of mindsets are important as you grow your SASE solution. And so I think, that's an important factor as well, how easy it is for you to administer all of these different use cases at scale.
Very good. Thanks for that. To be able to get to our second topic, let's continue the conversation and shift to our second topic, which is more around the how, right? So at least from the Dell'Oro perspective, we're slicing and dicing in a number of different ways. We obviously see that there are multiple vendors, and so I'd love to be able to get your thoughts about, as enterprises think about embracing a particular solution set, is that solution set best when it's a single vendor or a multi-vendor set of SASE capabilities? I think the other thing that we see is, while we acknowledge that SASE is an architecture for specific use cases or a collection of use cases, we also see that certain vendors are approaching it as a one-stop shop, right? So you can almost go to them and say, okay, treat SASE more as a shrink wrap product, and the networking and security is very tightly coupled together, right? So you're not having to go to a separate SD-WAN and a separate security vendor. You could just go to this vendor that has already done that tight integration, and we call that flavor of SASE the unified flavor. So it represents more of a product-centric perspective. And so I want to start with you, Parag, in terms of thinking about how the rubber meets the road along these dimensions of, should SASE be considered as the best instantiation when it's multi-vendor, or there are reasons for single vendor? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, so at Netskope, we want to offer our customers flexibility and choice. By definition, successful SASE would imply like fewer vendors, simpler operations, reduced complexity. And this is all to kind of lower cost, right, eventually. But we understand that it is a journey and it is not rip and replace. So if you look at it, like what options do customers have? One, they could have existing contracts, whether it's an SD-WAN contract or an SASE contract, it doesn't matter. Or they have multi-vendor environments. And in that case, you can kind of purchase individual products that are part of this SASE architecture. And for that, you really need tight and deep partnerships and integrations with many security and networking players. And on the other side, we have customers who would absolutely say, hey, you know what, I need like simplified operations. I need this SASE fabric of the future, and I need to connect my remote users, IoT devices, branch offices, multi-cloud environments, all in a single fabric. And in that case, you can purchase an entire Convert SASE platform from us. So I think it's just customer-centric. Both options should be supported. We conducted at Netskope recently we conducted a survey, right? And this was with 3,500 CIOs worldwide. And 81% of them said they are likely to purchase SASE from a single vendor in the future. And 75% of that group said that would happen in the next 1 to 4 years. So we know where the trend is headed. But at the same time, I think flexibility and choice is the key. If you want one thing that I would leave people with is, ask the vendors, right? Hey, how is 1 + 1 greater than 2? If I do dual vendors, tell me, like, how do you prove that you're better as a single solution? So that's the key. Like, you want to make sure you're asking vendors the right questions in order for a successful SASE implementation. And do an RFP, right? Like, start an RFP with a single vendor, dual vendor, with managed SASE, and pick the best solution that you like.
Very interesting. So I'd like to go to Mark, and then Craig, we can circle back if you've got some thoughts on this topic. But Parag, you mentioned that in your survey, there was the arrows pointing to desire for this to be a single vendor. Now, Mark, considering the MEF has got a strong service provider community, what are you hearing, right? And what's the perspective from the service provider community that do they have? Are you thinking in the same vein, or are you thinking differently?
We're going to touch on this in the next question, but I think I'm going to just offer a preview, and I'm going to offer maybe a little bit of a disagreement. I believe that if we look at SD-WAN and how SD-WAN evolved, there's no question that as the complexity level of SD-WAN rose, it provided opportunities for service providers, traditional managed service providers, to be able to jump into the market and then be able to address that complexity for those enterprise customers. And that would be in the face of the trend that Parag was referring to, where that enterprises are going to go jump off and do it themselves, even though there may be a need and desire to continue along the trend of the cloud journey, where enterprises may outsource that to managed service providers who are not going to just provide a few tightly integrated security functions the way it's indicated in your unified approach, Mauricio, but also it's going to empower those enterprises to be able to ask for more security functions that are going to be delivered through the SASE architecture. So I think that the longer term trend is that we're not going to move toward a single vendor. I think we're going to move to multiple vendors, and those multiple vendors are going to provide a richer and broader set of cybersecurity functions and applications that are going to be actually delivered in the SASE environment.
Very interesting, very interesting. Craig, I'd love to hear, since you're the tie-breaking vote in this picture.
Well, I'm not going to break the tie, because I'm going to say the answer is yes to both. It's I think anytime you have a new market space emerging, you will see a combination of vendors that are really strong in the networking vertical and security vertical coming together into a converged solution, as well as single vendors like VMware and Netskope that deliver everything. But I think that the service provider channel being very important doesn't mean single vendor SASE doesn't work either. I think, certainly service providers bring a lot of value in a world where there's a lot of disparate solutions you have to stitch together, but we shouldn't think of that as the only value they provide. SASE is still an all-encompassing technology with a lot of different use cases, a lot of different vendors with different pros and cons. And so service providers have another angle here, even in a single vendor SASE world, of helping users understand the nuances of the different solutions, helping them roll it out, helping them manage it on day two. And so I think we're probably trending towards single vendor SASE in the long term, but today definitely both approaches exist.
Always a consummate diplomat, Craig. Thank you. So Parag, given what you've heard, do you agree with Mark and Craig, or do you still think?
No, I think what I was merely pointing out is like the trend. Like I mentioned in the beginning, there is existing deep networking and security partnerships that you need in that multi-vendor environment, and which Netskope carries, right? And which we have to, like, you have existing contracts, for instance, or you may be in multi-vendor environment. I can't tell you so many times I go in and they'll say, oh, wow, I like this, but you know what? I have an existing contract that I can't come out of. And you have to be interoperable in all these scenarios, right? Like, and maybe I like a vendor 1 versus vendor 2. And who am I to dictate what vendor you should pick as a customer? So I think there is that aspect, right? And that is true. And then there is second aspect, which I strongly think, where vendors, as you pick a vendor on SASE, there should be a strong reason to do so. And you need to question the vendor. Hey, why is 1 + 1 greater than 2? Can you tell me how you give me that operational efficiency? Can you tell me how you make my WAN better by having this unified single solution? So I think that I do still think that the trend based on the surveys that we have done is headed in that single vendor SASE direction longer term. And then short term, you have to deal with these contractual things that are out there. But then we do see the pie move in that direction, wherein you will have that single vendor SASE. And including service providers, I can tell you so many RFPs, so many SPs have come in and said, you know what, you can really end up saving. You can do this AI-driven operations across like network and security. You can save cost for me, right? So there is that mindset as well, where like, while they have an existing solution, they'll come and say, but I need a separate solution for a single vendor SASE as well. So we see that a lot from managed service providers happening.
Very good. And just to share some color, because I agree with all of you in terms of Parag, the longer term trend that the degree of consumption of single vendor, more tightly integrated unified SASE is continuing to grow and represent a larger share of the market. And at least what we see is that today that blossoming is happening in what we term to be lean IT types of enterprises. So predominantly the smaller mid-sized enterprises that don't have that specialized networking or security. Because I think one of the things that we see is that the larger enterprises, you start getting into the Fortune 500, they typically have very specialized IT staff. They have very strong affinity to particular vendor sets. And when it comes to networking security, it's not always the same vendor, right? So one may have the networking team may have a preference for vendor A, and the security team has a preference for vendor B. And so they're in the space of reconciling and pushing these worlds that may have been separated out and the vendors separated out and to come together and start coupling together their solutions in the form of SASE that we call disaggregated. But as the market evolves, as the products evolve, the solutions evolve, we definitely see that will enable companies to move in a direction of embracing a different, more unified class of solution. So it's very interesting how the spectrum isn't necessarily a one size fits all, but one where there are various factors beyond just the state of technology. So let's move on to our last topic here, which we already touched on a little bit, right? So Mark, I teased you out a little bit to start discussing this, but the third discussion topic, which is the consumption patterns, specifically with SASE in the portion that is consumed as a managed service. We've been looking at this from the SD-WAN perspective. So I've brought in a couple data points from my report, which basically shows here is the portion of the technology market. If you think of the SD-WAN technology pie being 100%, the slice that is consumed as a managed service has been growing over time. So I'd like to start with you, Mark, and you've already stolen your thunder a little bit in saying that the complexities of a multi-vendor SASE solution are a space for service provider to come in to help enterprises. But I want to explore beyond that, whether there are other reasons why there may be, or is that the only reason why enterprises would consider a managed service offering to consume these technologies? So Mark, I'd like for you to kick it off.
All right, and this chart is consistent and maybe a little bit different than some other data that I've seen, where it's closer to half and half. I mean, I've seen, and depending on what the size of the enterprise is, that's certainly going to matter. I think that, you know, my colleagues already brought that up, is that there's no one size fits all. So let's first just acknowledge that there's a need for vendor provided solutions and managed services. That's why we're seeing the demand. That's why we're seeing the shift. But there's a couple of factors that are going to hinder adoption of managed services. One of them is that the network and security organizations, or at least for many enterprises, is traditionally two separate, distinct organizations. And if you're going to create a converged offering, you have to figure out who you're going to sell it to, who's the buying center for that particular offering. And that's going to be one thing. That's going to change over time, but it doesn't happen overnight. That's for certain. So the second factor is that if we look at the long-term outsourcing trend of enterprise IT, there is a propensity to look at cloud services in the long term. And maybe we're talking about semantics to some extent, because if a vendor who traditionally provides hardware and software decides to become a service provider, or decides to offer solutions and they're priced in a subscription model or a consumption-based model, maybe it is just semantics is what we're talking about. A managed service provider to some, a vendor to others, maybe that's converging as well. So I think that there's maybe less controversy here than might appear at first glance, but there is an undeniable trend that smaller organizations, SMBs for certain, are going to be looking for managed services to be able to address not only the complexity of their networks, but to do it in a way that allows them the management flexibility that they're looking for to be able to address their financial needs as well. And I think that those are some of the main trade-offs to consider in the DIY versus, the do-it-yourself versus managed service provider discussion that's going on in the industry. And I think there's also one other aspect, and that is and it's just the very definition that how SASE really took off, that Gartner defined SASE in a particular model. Well, if we bring in, and that model had 7 security functions, it was very rigidly defined. And what I'm finding in talking to service providers, certainly throughout the MEF, is that they have a very different view of SASE in that sense. They look at it as a cloud-hosted architecture that's ideal to address not just the remote workforce, but of course the even more complex hybrid workforce, which Mauricio, your data indicated. And in that scenario, what we can expect if we're going to be addressing the hybrid workforce with that complexity is that there's going to be a whole range of security functions that are going to be needed to address regulatory, privacy constraints, a whole range of security constraints, not just a single set of requirements. So it's not we have one problem and we have one solution. We have many problems and there'll be many solutions. And I think that Craig and Parag have already addressed this by talking about the use cases. So I don't think we're that far away in the end. I think there's just going to be a need, like as Craig pointed out, for multiple different solutions in both the quote unquote vendor and the managed services arenas.
Thanks for that color, Mark. Craig or Parag, you guys agree, disagree?
Yeah, I think, for us, the route to market, the managed service provider route to market is obviously bigger. It's more than 50% of what we do at VMware. And I think I want to bring it back to something you said, sort of wrapping up the last question. You said, what if the network engineers prefer one vendor and the security engineers prefer a different vendor? And I think just that manner of thinking underscores another shift that is happening and has to happen, which is network and security are converging, not just in the products that we offer, but also for the people building these solutions on the ground, right? How can you evaluate something like a ZTNA solution with forward error correction built in? Is that a network problem or a security problem? Well, it's a little bit of both, right? And so I think while MSPs have helped in modernizing networks with SD-WAN, there's another opportunity to help here because vendors are converging products at the same time that customers are converging networking and security as a buying center, as a single team. And so having a trusted advisor as you go through that transition, I think that can help as well. So I think there's a lot of areas where managed services can help as SASE emerges.
Thanks for that. What about you, Parag?
Yeah, I kind of agree with both Mark and Craig. I think it's very use case centric. For example, we are in an OT customer doing literally those machines, and we are in that machines, and there's no managed service provider involved there, right? And it's with a machine builder. But then when you go to a branch office and when you go to a certain other use cases, there is, more people want to get circuits, not just SASE, right? I want which service providers am I going to use and have that single throat to choke. So from that perspective, you will see, like in the branch offices, a lot of times you will see MSPs bundling not just SASE, they'll take SD-WAN, security, circuits, add their SLAs on top, like do all of these things, combine it and deliver it as a full service, right? So I think the opportunity is big. I do think there are two kinds of deployments that come in. Whether you pick single vendor or multi-vendor, both are options again for a managed SASE offering. But when you see the deployments, one is what we call as full over the top, wherein you can use SD-WAN and you can use the SSE full blown as a service, right? And you can deliver it completely over the top. So you don't have to install anything in your network. And then you have other larger telcos. For example, we made an announcement with Orange recently, who is a leading telco, and they announced Netskope POPs deployed within Orange telco cloud platform, right? So now you have that more deeper integrated deployments for SASE as well. So I think it kind of depends. There are multiple deployment models within SASE, and then you can still be on a single vendor or a dual vendor path.
I see. So thanks for that color. I want to go back and what I've heard is the world in the previous conversation settled out that the world is shifting, that as the sophistication of solutions increases and the convergence increases, that we're going to move into this converged unified class of solutions, or a single vendor solution. And but then by the same token, the purchasing centers ostensibly are also changing. If that's the case, then for the large enterprise, where today it's more of a do-it-yourself today, given the specialization and the capacity, versus in the small to medium enterprise where they have lean IT and they tend to, as we've I think Mark and others have noted, tend to go to the service provider route in increasing fashion. If we think about the large enterprise and the solution being moving in a unified direction, and the purchasing and these teams, the networking and security teams coming together, why would large enterprise still consider a managed service offering? So do you foresee that the large enterprise would move in a direction of what is happening in the small to mid enterprises, or is that class of large enterprise customer going to be happy as a clam, just continue to do it yourself? And Mark, I'll circle back with you and pose a question and open it up to the others. What's your perspective in that large enterprise space?
One of the aspects of that question is, and to provide a concise answer, is that the large enterprise is looking for connectivity. They're not just looking for security functions. They have a much more involved problem of branch offices that could be distributed, different types of facilities, partners that they want to integrate into the mix as well, and also acquisitions where maybe there's a different technology base, maybe there's a different vendor installed. Someone has to go and sort out just the connectivity side. Then you can layer on top the multi-cloud access with SD-WAN, which of course is going to be now integrated into the SASE architecture to be able to deliver this more secure access, plus the ability to support users wherever they are. And in the case of some of the large enterprises, it's literally wherever they may be. I mean, they could be all over the world, and they will be. So, and when you look at that kind of complexity, and you look at the need to be able to coordinate the communications across these national boundaries or even these regional boundaries, that's where a large service provider can come in with predefined relationships with many other service providers so they can actually provide all the connectivity and even the SD-WAN overlays for that various different, that kind of heterogeneous environment. Now, it doesn't mean that necessarily that an enterprise wouldn't take it on, because some enterprises look like a service provider in terms of the type of network they operate, the type of services they deliver to certainly partners, and maybe they are a service provider. Again, we might be back in that semantical discussion, but clearly there are others who are really struggling to be able to provide secure connectivity with a threat landscape that's changing by the day, and the need to be able to handle whatever connectivity services is at that edge or whatever what is at that customer site, and then to be able to bring that all together. That is not a trivial exercise, and there are a few vendors who have the breadth and certainly can even address the multi-vendor environment, even though that's changing. I mean, I think the multi-vendor environment is more the norm than the exception. But that's one reason why they may be looking to a service provider to step in and then be able to provide that communications and security integrations function that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes.
I see. Interesting. Very interesting. Any closing remarks on this last question, Craig and Parag? Do you guys disagree or agree?
No, I think we covered it pretty much. Yeah. But
Very
I
good.
agree with what Mark said, right? I think it's going to be a split bag. It's going to be use case centric. Some enterprises may say, you know what, for my remote workforce, I don't want an MSP. I want an MSP for my branch offices. So it really depends. Like they may pick projects or they may give the whole thing to the MSP. It's been, I do agree with Mark. Like it's almost split, right, between like MSP versus DIY.
At least the takeaway that I'm hearing is that the large enterprises have more technical capacity from an IT perspective, but the class of problems are just that much larger that transcend the SASE set of conversations that we've been discussing to get into the transport, the connectivity, the other peripheral areas that the service providers have historically been very strong in, right? So ultimately leading and opening the opportunity to engagements by the service provider community, even with that class of large enterprise that looking at compared to the smaller enterprise who needs the help even for the basics, the big guys will still appreciate the service provider capabilities in that larger picture. So it's an interesting landscape.
One thing, Mauricio, that same survey that I was talking about, right, with the 3,500 CIOs, one interesting other stat we found from that was 2/3 of them, they kind of noted that SASE will change how they structure their teams in future. So including where you formally have these separate groups like security and networking, they sit in separate organization, who has the budget control. So they are kind of still in that process of figuring out how they'll structure this, which becomes an important point to this, whether they do it themselves or they kind of like what Craig mentioned, right? Like, are these taking independent decisions or are they taking the decision together?
Yes, no, it's a organizational change is something definitely abreast, and but it's one that a lot of enterprises seem to be going a lot slower than and naturally so, right? We've been 20 years of silos, so breaking those silos isn't necessarily easy. Well, we're at the end of our time together. I'd like for each of you to provide any closing remarks about today's conversation, right? Anything else that you'd like to be able to share with the audience? And we'll go in reverse. So we'll start with you, Mark, and then Parag and Craig. So first, Mark, any closing remarks or thoughts from today's conversation?
Yes. First of all, I want to thank NetEvents for this opportunity to address such an important topic. So thank you for that. And secondly, SASE being an architecture is going to certainly evolve as to what security functions are going to be deployed. I think the closing thought that I have is not to think of it as a unified entity. I think that's a very limiting view, and I think it's certainly going to evolve over time. The security landscape is huge, and no one is going to be able to address every single aspect of such a highly segmented set of problems. So I think it's the architecture that needs to be extensible to be able to address that. And then the second point is that, if we look, it's just that history would guide us to think that managed service providers are going to have a big part of SASE. I don't believe it's going to converge on the single vendor approach unless vendors turn into service providers.
Very interesting. Well, thank you for that, Mark. Parag.
Well, I have a slightly different view. I think, the world has kind of moved from what I call one-to-one to one-to-many, which is what SD-WAN was doing a lot. And then now it is into this many-to-many world, right? You have many users, many devices, many IoT endpoints, branches trying to connect to many applications, which are hybrid or multi-cloud environments. But I do think you need something, one consistent software, one policy, one architecture, one framework that can deliver this uniform security and performance with less number of vendors. It kind of gives you that, you can save, obviously you can have a good ROI, save cost. You want something that is very simple to deploy anywhere from like a home to a cloud to everywhere in between, and give you really that consistent security, consistent performance. Look for those architectures, look for those vendors, ask questions, right? You want someone who can interoperate and then put you on this journey that can get you to a point where it's really simple to operate your entire infrastructure and give you that consistent uniform performance and security.
Thanks, Parag. Last but not least, Craig, parting thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with Parag. So, one of the things that we can do as our customers and as our companies are converging networking and security is look to managed service providers, not just to be the ones to offload the service management, but also to help advise the team on what the landscape looks like and how to bring those two different things that have been siloed for so long together, as you said. And so whether it's one vendor or multi-vendor, I think the importance is that you're getting that ROI, you're getting that simplicity, and you're able to meet those use cases that you need to deploy. And so that's where the expertise of managed service can really come in and help.
Thanks for that, Craig. Again, my deep appreciation and thanks to my distinguished set of panelists. Hopefully everyone has found this conversation insightful. I did. I learned something new every time I sit down with folks like our panelists. Well, with that, again, thank you very much for all of my panelists. Thank you to the audience.